Hello and welcome everyone to this version of the APFF and EPA hosted workshop related to open data. We're absolutely delighted to have you joining us today. And my name is Camilla Bullock. I am the CEO of the Emerging Payments Association Asia, but I'm also the Sherpa of the APFF's Open Data Working Group. And this workshop that we're hosting today is something that we've done for the last 4 years. And it's really where we collect and test our inputs to a report that we every year write for the Asia Pacific Financial Forum that then is put forward to the Asia Business Council. And the discussion has changed a little bit over years, but in 2023, we put some guiding principle of how to design open data frameworks in APAC with a glance and looking at cross-border open data. Because where we sit, we talk a lot about payments, of course, and we see that there is no payments without the movement of data, and hence there is a principle in this. So with that, I want to flag that when we talk about open data, it's not always just related as you would see in the PSD2, PSD3 open banking. We have a slightly broader perspective where we're talking about two-way exchange of consent data in a secure manner. And we're specifically looking at how this data that is enabled to exchange is enabling access, because access is such an important word here. We have, during last year's workshop and working groups within the EPAA and APFF, we looked at how to apply the open data frameworks on something that we could understand of how it's creating value. And we applied it on trade. And with that also adjusted some of our principles that we put forward to APAC. This year, what we've done, at several instances, we've been collaborating with GFTN, which is the Thought Leadership Instant under MAS. So we hosted a roundtable during their Insight Forum in Singapore in November and also in Japan. And we've really been narrowing in and looking, where are the gaps in the principles that we put forward previously? And that is what we're going to look at in 3 panels today. We're going to look at ensuring MSMEs have a voice for open data policymaking. We're going to look at addressing regulatory mismatch in open data frameworks. And then one of my favorites that I say, I can see that this will do it, but I don't know yet. And that is implementing privacy-enhancing technology paths to secure open data. But before we're diving into today's sessions, I would encourage you who has joined, just put in what location you're joining from. If you have any questions through the session, please pop them in the chat. And also, I have been asked to say to all of you who are looking at this recording afterwards, which we know is many, thank you. If you have questions afterwards, please send them on an email to us. We love feedback. We are going to open the session hearing from JC Paranes. He's the coordinator for the Asia Pacific Financial Forum. And I want to say, JC, thank you for all the work you're doing in coordinating the different working groups under APFF. It's extremely important work. And you really have a knack of magneting in the passionate, not just payments people, but passionate people that wants to enhance the industry we're in. So JC, over to you.
Thank you, Camilla. Well, good afternoon to everyone here, and also good evening or morning to those joining us online. It's really a great pleasure for us in ABAC and APFF to welcome you to this workshop, which will discuss a topic that is increasingly gaining the attention of regulators and industry across the region, and that is open data. Just to briefly provide you a background, a couple of years ago, the APEC Business Advisory Council endorsed the open data guidelines compiled by the APFF Open Data Working Group. As we all know, there is great complexity surrounding their development, and there is a strong argument for agreed common principles to assist in developing interoperable open data. Such common principles would be very useful in bridging the differing goals of jurisdictions with regard to implementation and provide clarity on objectives and strategies. This year, ABAC and APFF agreed to follow up and solicit perspectives from industry, regulators, and officials, and multilateral organizations and other relevant stakeholders in order to provide insights to help update on common principles. Before I conclude, let me thank our host, the EPA Asia, as well as our APFF FMI network for working tirelessly over the past several weeks to put together this workshop. I would also like to thank our panelists and moderators for joining us in here virtually and for sharing their precious time and knowledge with us. So let me wish us all a fruitful and successful workshop. Thank you very much. Over to you, Camila.
Thank you. Thank you, JC, for opening this today. And I am very lucky. I have a co-Sherpa in the Open Data Working Group, so I don't have to coordinate it all myself. Holly Dorber, who is also on the EPA Advisory Board. She's also the chair of Australia Services Roundtable, and she heads up the government relations for PayPal. She will today help us to segue through the panels and run some commentary on top of that. But the first thing she's going to do is really to set the scene. And we have a fantastic guest with us, Javier Lopez Gonzalez, who is the OECD senior economist. So, Holly, I'm going to hand over to you to have a fireside chat before we dive into the program.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you very much, JC, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. As Camilla said, the topic of open data can be very narrow, but it can also be very broad and encompass a lot of different policy challenges. So as Camilla said, we've got Javier Lopez Gonzalez with us today, who is one of the, I don't think it would be overly generous to say, one of the foremost experts in quantifying the benefits of digital trade. And so it's a real thrill for us to have him here with us on the workshop today. And I thought the best way to kick us off, Javier, would be just to ask you, in your world and in the world of digital trade, what does open data mean to you?
Thank you, Holly, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the very flattering remarks. There's many of us that are trying to sort of make our way through the quantification of this environment, but I think we all agree that digitalization, open data is sort of one of the most important aspects of growing globalization. In terms of your question, what does open data mean to you? Maybe I would agree with the earlier statement that it's perhaps a broader thing. Perhaps two things come to mind. The first one is the idea of expanding digital connectivity. Now, we know that digital connectivity has fundamentally transformed global trade. It's made it faster, it's made it much broader in terms of scope, but also more inclusive, allowing firms of different sizes, particularly smaller firms, reach global audiences with much greater ease. And the benefits of this digital connectivity are growing. Our research shows that digital connectivity reduces trade costs 3 times more today than it did 20 years ago. And that trend is continuing. At the same time, we also find that digital connectivity delivers what we're calling a double dividend. It means more international trade, as I just said, easier to connect globally, but it also means more domestic trade. And also, digital connectivity, open data means more trade for all sectors of the economy and for countries at all levels of development. So whether you're a Philippine SME exporting back office services, you're a Japanese car maker, Vietnamese rice exporter, open data connectivity is fundamental for you to gain business traction. And the second thing that it means is related to what Camilla was mentioning. It means more open but also trusted data flows. This means enabling cross-border data movement while ensuring that we have the appropriate safeguards that build trust between different actors in the digital economy. So it's about the flow and the protection of data together. And this is sometimes something that we call in the policy world data free flows with trust. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. No, that's really helpful. How should we be thinking about the benefits of achieving this type of free flow of data with trust?
So I think that we need to first and foremost think about what it is that data gives us. What are the benefits kind of broadly, and then try to think whether we can start quantifying them. I think, first of all, thinking about data being the lifeblood of the global economy, clearly there are benefits from being able to connect with family and friends located in different geographical locations. There's also benefits of open data related to the support of research that addresses global challenges. I'm thinking, the development of vaccines in the context of COVID-19, but also, research related to the green transition. Importantly as well for economic activities, the coordination of production along global supply chains which dominate globalization, and of course the reductions in trade costs that I mentioned earlier. But it's important to think about some of the concerns that cross-border data flows raise, from privacy and data protection to national security, cybersecurity, and regulatory reach. And here it's quite easy to think that we want our data to flow, but we also want it to somehow flow with the desired protection so that we're not operating in the Wild West. And so what's happened is perhaps some uncoordinated increase in measures that condition the movement of data or that mandates that data be stored locally. And so we've taken this evolving regulatory environment and thought through with some economists from the WTO about how we might be able to quantify this. And we released a paper recently in February about this. Maybe I wanted to draw your attention to some of the key findings from this work. Now, the first one is just how important open data is. And so we are able to quantify that if all economies were suddenly to restrict their cross-border data flows, we find that global GDP would fall by about 4.5% and global exports would fall by about 8.5%. So truly, those are very big numbers, really highlighting the importance of open data initiatives overall. The second thing that we found from this work, which I think is important here, is that the absence of data flow regulation is perhaps not a solution. Now, if all economies remove their data flow regulation, we would certainly see trade costs fall. So it would be cheaper to send data out. But we would also see much needed safeguards that generate trust benefits also reduce. And we find that overall GDP would fall by nearly 1% and global exports by over 2%. So the safeguards that accompany the data are important. But it is important to get that balance right. And that brings me to my third finding, which is that the type of regimes where we're seeing that which care about open data, but which also have transparent safeguards and sort of safeguards that take care of this open data initiatives, they can yield significant gains and lead to global GDP increases of about 1.7% and global increases in export of about 3.6%. So for us, the key takeaway from this work is essentially just how important getting this right is, and that we need interoperable, cooperative frameworks, not the current sort of fragmented approaches to open data and cross-border data flows. And this is why we think that international cooperation is critical in order to achieve this objective.
That makes perfect sense. And that number, that GDP number, is material. So it's always helpful to be able to quantify that when we're thinking about public policy responses, which brings me to my next question, which is, and you touched a little bit on this in your last answer, but how also should we think about the role of public policy, and what can public policy do in terms of achieving the reduction in fragmentation and interoperability at a regulatory level that might deliver these benefits?
So I think that's also a really good question. And my personal belief is that public policy and international discussions can do quite a lot, and we have some numbers to back this up. But let me first maybe take a step back and just underscore how important the digital economy is for international trade and for global relations. We find that it represents around a quarter of global trade, digital trade, or what we might call digital trade. And we also find that in a world where we're seeing sort of a lot of tariffs, a lot of different geoeconomic new emerging situations, we're still finding that digital trade is the fastest growing element of international trade. And what we're seeing is that accompanying this increase in digital trade in the global economy is a lot of digital trade discussions. since the year 2000, half of all the trade agreements that we've signed have a digital trade provision of some sort. That's over 100, 120 different agreements. We're seeing the birth of new digital economy agreements that touch on new issues, including on issues of artificial intelligence, undersea water cables, digital identities. So really a lot of effort in trying to move the policy agenda forward and accompany this change. And also one that is very important is the WTO agreement on e-commerce, which is something where the text was concluded in July last year, and which we're currently trying to incorporate into sort of the WTO framework. And so to give you an idea of where we are in all of this in terms of policy, we've developed an index called the Digital Trade Integration and Openness Index. And this allows us to get a better sense of progress in these areas. And we have three key findings here. The first one is that we're making good progress. We've seen digital integration and openness rise, and we credit sort of that to also the increases in digital trade globally. But there's still a lot of work we need to do. We are only 8% of the way towards full digital trade integration. The journey ahead is long, but it is going to be full of benefits. The second is that there are strong differences across countries. There's a lot of countries like Singapore, like Australia, like the UK that have signed a lot of digital trade agreements or digital economy agreements, but there's a lot of other countries that have not. And sort of this poses challenges in terms of that interoperability that I was talking about earlier, because there's still a lot of markets which remain quite fragmented. And the last one is that it is really important to try and involve more countries into digital trade integration and openness, because they are the ones that tend to deliver. So having minimum standards is really important because that delivers quite a lot of gains. We find that if the WTO agreement on e-commerce would be signed and would be put into force between the 71 countries that currently support it, we would see global digital trade integration and openness increase by about 20%, which would lead to increases in trade of about 2%. So we're really talking about big numbers for a very minimal sort of type of standard agreement. So for me, international cooperation and public policy matters if we want to avoid regulatory fragmentation, if we want to ensure that we're generating the big opportunities and continue to accompany sort of the digital transformation in the sort of global digital economy.
That's really interesting. I might ask one just quick follow-up question to what you were just mentioning there. Given Camilla her opening comment about there's no payments without the movement of data, we might argue that 100% of trade is digital in some aspects, because payments for the purposes of cross-border trade these days are digital. And so getting those agreements and commitments and the settings right for payments as distinct from broader financial services is a really critical aspect of future-proofing trade agreements that are being negotiated or updated or renegotiated as we speak. But to that end, how does the OECD define digital trade in all of the numbers that you're tracking?
So look, that's a very good question, and it's something that we ask ourselves quite a lot. You know, to what extent are definitions, or should definitions, evolve as we move along? The way that we define digital trade is twofold, which makes things a bit confusing. First one is we take the WTO definition. The WTO definition says anything that is sort of digitally ordered, digitally delivered, or has any type of digital trace in it would be called digital trade, but it doesn't singularly identify the payments aspect of it. So that's why we don't count all trade as digital trade. The second definition, which is the one that our statistical modelers are using for statistical purposes, is digitally ordered or digitally delivered trade. So it's about trade that is ordered through specifically designed digital media, or trade that is digitally delivered. And that digitally ordered and digitally delivered trade is the one that I'm quoting as sort of representing a quarter of all trade. I have to say that I agree with your view that, you know, ultimately a lot of this relies on international payments, which are inherently digital. And sort of perhaps that's one of the areas where we at the OECD need to think more carefully about sort of the invisible factors that are supporting this sort of global revolution of digital trade. And I think payments has a very big role to play in that.
Maybe just one to round us out, because I'm mindful that we're going to move into the next panel soon. But how do you think about thinking that we're looking at this from the perspective or with the lens of micro, small and medium businesses? Is there anything that you could share with us around the specific benefits of digital trade or the quantifiable benefits of a more cohesive international regulatory framework as it pertains to the benefits to smaller businesses?
Yes, I think so. From the perspective of someone that maybe sits in Paris and sort of in their desk running econometric regressions, we do sort of then check back with different firms and ask them, like, does this really make a difference? How does this really make a difference? And sort of the type of feedback that we get is essentially something like, okay, well, we're trying to trade, and sort of let's try and trace all our different activities to their digital components. And so, for example, we've talked to several SMEs that have highlighted, look, 90% of our clients are outside. And sort of we communicate with them through digital media. So that's one of like the digital connectivity element to it. But also some of the contracts that we sign are digital and require e-signatures. And sort of we need to make sure that with the type of agreements that we have in place, whether they're digital trade agreements in RTAs or provisions in RTAs or other, that we are able to recognize and have legal backing for having e-signatures and e-contracts. At the same time, a lot of SMEs then tell us, well, one of the problems we have is essentially that we do not know what level of protection we need to afford to what customer in what country, and we do not necessarily understand all the different mechanisms that are about and whether we're operating within the bounds of what we should be doing or not. And so all of that translates into a greater certainty, for instance, through provisions on cross-border data flows or through discussions on privacy and data protection and things like that. So whenever you talk to SMEs and you ask them about the specific chapters that are in the digital trade discussions, there's always a very useful example that you can come with the way that these chapters can support certainty in their activities. And it also helps governments as well in terms of trying to meet legitimate public policy objectives.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. That's fantastic. Javier, thank you so much. I think you lived up to your lofty introduction from my perspective anyway. I'm sure they'll tell us in the chat. If not, but from my perspective, thank you very much. It's enlightening and we learn something when we talk to you every time. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us to kick us off. I think for the rest of us, thanks, Javier. And for the rest of our sessions today, there's a lot of food for thought there. And if we keep those sort of more macro principles in mind as we move into the next three panels, it will serve us well when we come back at the end to wrap up with some real tangible and practical recommendations from APFF into the ABAC process. And so with that, I am going to hand over to Monica, who is going to moderate our first panel session, which, funnily enough, is about how we can make sure small and medium businesses have a voice in open data policy making. And I would just say, just before we start this session, if you have a question, please feel free to pop it in the chat. If we have time, we'll come to them. But the more participation from our audience, I think the more valuable the conversation will be today. So with that, I'll hand over to Monica, and thank you very much. I'll see you at the end of this one.
Thank you so much, Holly. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone who's joined us. And thank you to Felipe and to Kamar for joining us on the panel today. We'll be talking about how and ensuring MSMEs have a voice in open data policy making. We're going to explore how micro, small, and medium enterprises can shape open data frameworks to drive financial inclusion. As you know, I come from India. India's account aggregator system has been a success story in terms of empowering millions by enabling secure data sharing for better financial inclusion. And this has been somewhat of a case study that has been highlighted all across the globe. Today, we are going to discuss specifically about MSME representation in collaborative policy design and measuring the impact. I'm Monica Jasuja, I'm the moderator, and I'm joined by Felipe from Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance and Kamar Salim from IFC's SME Finance Forum. Let's dive right in. We only have about 25 minutes, so if you have questions, I'll be monitoring the chat and I'll try to ensure that we are able to ask our panelists these questions, just like Holly said. So please keep these questions coming in. So Felipe, let's start off with you. How can MSMEs meaningfully influence open data policies across jurisdictions?
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Good morning and afternoon and evening. Yeah, good question. And also it can lead to big discussions. Well, I think have a meaningful influence is such a big group. Those MSMEs, they represent a very big share of the economies globally, and there is certain ways that it could be done. Having some co-creation space or innovation offices, or I think the main thing is to ensure that when you design policies, you make sure that the governance structure is made to have the representation. We have some examples which come from our research when it comes to bringing the voice of MSMEs, and I think we recently have a publication about how associations, like fintech associations, how they work and how they ensure their members also have these active representations. And one of the interesting things is that the members of those associations, they do want to the associations to ensure that they have this representation, like in advocacy or influencing policy or law or regulation. So how they can do that, like ensuring like networking and relationship building, and ensuring that MSMEs will participate in like events with public actors, but I think also ensuring that the private sector is in those meetings or in those convenings is important. And I think one of the most interesting findings we have is, if you think about like emerging economies, it's still more important. If you go to our report, you can see it's almost everyone, literally almost 100% of the respondents says that their member really value the networking and the capacity building and those advocacy influence. So it's super important. This is what the MSMEs are looking for, and this is how those chambers or associations can make sure they will have this, they will offer to their members this strong representation. So yes, it's hard to involve everyone when they are just such a big group, but having those channels that allow them to have their voice is super important. And of course, the role in our case, as we are studying the digital finance market and the fintech associations as well, their role in ensuring this representation is super important, even more for emerging economies.
Kamar, what do you think about this?
Thanks, Monica. And again, I think it's at a critical juncture. We as SME Finance Forum host the MSME Finance Gap, and we just released our new report, which says $5.7 trillion is the finance gap that exists in the space right now. So we had mapped out because as a forum we are connected to all the Sorry, I think there is some feedback.
Can you please
Yes.
mute yourself, everyone?
Yes.
Please go ahead,
Yeah, so I think we mapped out, there are 4 verticals we see: access to finance, access to markets, access to skills, and access to enabling environment. We mapped out there are nearly 60 stakeholders, 60 institutions, and hence, but still SMEs are data poor. I mean, why is that? Because there is no interoperability of data, there is no capture of data. But most importantly, SMEs don't even understand the benefits of this. I think And the clear benefits in terms of decision making, effectiveness, cost savings, enhanced innovations, improved competitiveness, increased access to market opportunities. There are clear benefits to the SMEs that they are not able to decipher through. And when it comes to policy making, large corporations, governments, regulators are pretty much driving the policy making in the open data. So what needs to happen, in my opinion, is that I think there are a few things that need to happen in terms of A, we need to involve SMEs early on into the policy making rather than being a recipient of what policies have been made. That's one. Then I think there needs to be an enhanced understanding of the SMEs of what the open data entails. And there's a role of private sector, public sector, financial sector, and the real sector in creating that awareness. So I think that's the second thing. Then you mentioned, Monica, the India's account aggregator. So running pilots like that, through programs like that, that's a great example. And there are other examples in Brazil, in UK, and there are some other examples where such pilots have been run. Then I think garnering coalitions. So SMEs are, there are millions of SMEs around the world. It's very hard to hear their voice. So industry associations, SME associations, trade bodies. Felipe alluded to that earlier. Then there needs to be regional dialogues because it cannot be just Asia because we are seeing increasing fragmentation of policies. So how do we create regional, cross-regional dialogues? Advocacy, institutions like ourselves, we sit on many boards and seats. I think we need to do advocacy, and by involving us into these discussions creates those platforms. And regulatory sandboxes, other means that we involve SMEs more effectively into the decision making. And then what gets measured gets improved. So I think putting some metrics in place, some measurement frameworks in place on the effectiveness of how such policies are actually benefiting. So I think in summary, I feel that SMEs, are very dispersed entities. We need to have an aggregated structure in which we can engage SMEs more effectively. And policy, they should not be simply recipients of the policy making. They should be, in some ways, architects of it as well.
This is really interesting, Kamal, because you mentioned a lot of words here: commitment, trust, coalitions, pilots, education, and being able to understand the benefits of what we're really trying to extend to them. But this brings me to my next question. Since you mentioned coalitions, and I know Felipe mentioned about associations and these MSMEs having a voice through a collective rather than individually. So in this particular paradigm, since we also need to think about their education and how they see value in what is being trying to be done here, how do you think incentives or sponsorships or any such kind of programs actually help to further the objective that we have with them? Kamar, if you can go first.
Sure. So I would phrase it around three pillars. I think one is around governance. The second is around structural enablers, and the third is around incentives. I think these are the three aspects that I'd like to talk about. So in terms of governance, now, even within a country, we talk to many stakeholders, and even within a country, sometimes the stakeholders are not talking to one another. What to talk of regionally or globally. So I think there needs to be more formalized structures in place. For example, you can set up secretariats, you can set up committees, you can set up independent implementation entities. You can create working groups. You need to create an oversight and a support mechanism that crowds in different stakeholders. And for example, like we were working on a new policy framework in a country. We had created under the central bank, 9 different stakeholders working group that worked together for 3 years on implementing a new prudential regulation. So that helped. So I think we need to have governance coordination in place through structural, and don't leave it to chance, because it's not going to happen if you leave it to chance. I think that's one. The second is around structural enablers. You need to have SMEs or SMEs bodies having formal seats in advisory bodies and technical working groups. So they're not just represented by intermediaries by themselves as well. So you have, we have seen in countries you form a group of 50 SMEs across different, and you create constant feedback loop mechanism. So I think the second thing. Then having intermediation platforms, even SME association, you'll be surprised to know there's no global or regional associations of SME associations. Every country has its own structures. So I think how can you create intermediary platforms which crowds in different types of entities, even industry associations, and then putting some metrics, as I earlier mentioned, into place. Creating some structural enablers. That brings me to my third aspect, the incentives. And I briefly mentioned on the importance of creating regulatory sandboxes that prioritize SME participation. A lot of regulatory sandboxes do not incentivize or have structural means for SMEs to participate in that. I think that's one. Then preferential access to DPIs, digital public infrastructures like APIs, consent dashboards. So these kind of preferential access to regulatory and DPI mechanisms is important. Capacity building grants, I think it's not just about doing skill building. You need to create grants, you need to create mechanisms where you can not only serve the SMEs, because SME you can divide it into 20 different ways, but really go down to the pyramid, which we call truly the missing middle or the new missing middle, the very small enterprises, the youth, the women, the agri, the rural. How do you read those segments? And for that, an enhanced amount of capacity building is needed. And then outcome-based incentives like better credit scores or reduced compliance needs. So creating some incentives which are more outcome-based and not just linked to encouraging an action. So these are some of the incentives that we've seen work in some of the markets, and happy to talk more about it at a later stage.
I think governance, collaboration, and obviously an incentive structure to try and address the needs of different niches. I think this is what I heard. And this is actually why this dialogue that we are having right now is extremely important, because like you mentioned, there aren't the bridges that are possible or aren't even available to help address the problems which are simply common across jurisdictions, but there isn't a unifying force that actually represents them. So Felipe, if I can go to you, what would you like to add in terms of the governance or the incentive structures that can actually help build this voice more effectively and can be addressed in governance?
Yes, well, I do believe like governance is key. If you have a good governance structure, and I second many things that Mr. Kamar said. Well, we have some like such good examples. Like if you think in the Brazilian open banking governance structure, for instance, they will have like representatives from different sectors, like from the tech side, from the association side, and from the government side. So you make sure that through those people you bring the needs of MSMEs into the table, and of course you can understand better through these inclusive governance frameworks. There are more examples. I think one good one is like Estonia open source a structure. They do make sure that they put public and private sector together, which and creates those open data frameworks. Then you can connect many dots together. It's such an important structure. And I think APIs, to have like, if you have good APIs, standardized ones, is also a good way into to think about how you make these structures to incentive their participation. But yes, I think one thing we try to understand here in our research is how you make like to bring these incentives to MSMEs to use those data rails. I think our last study where we selected some countries in APAC to see how MSMEs access credit through digital finance firms. You can see there's still a big share of companies which they struggle to provide even simple documents to apply for credit. And this is what we try to do. I think the outcome based incentive that Mr. Karma said is important. So we try to show like, okay, what is your pain point, and then bring it into the discussion. So like, I think open data can support these pain points. Okay, documentation is something very important, like that MSME struggle to bring. So how you make it more like clear for those players, but open banking or open finance structures can be such important. But then how you then make the step further? No, okay, you put in place those regimes, and companies can start using those open APIs and those infrastructure, or those digital public infrastructure. But then how you make this step further? No, it's not only accessing the data or making the concept based for MSMEs like such an important thing, but then how you make it a structure that you use for a better crash scoring system and so on. So yes, I think you have to not only hear, but try to make to bring those incentives for the this the supplier also see, okay, it can be a good for me to deploy credits for MSMEs, or to see what are their pain points, and then make it to develop into better products, or inclusive inclusive finance. So yes, I think not only incentive and structure, but how you make this step further to really bring to real world product and service.
I just briefly also ask both of you for very quick short comments on what would be some reliable metrics that we can depend on, which actually help us measure how involved or how the MSMEs get with these kind of projects, as well as, of course, whether the right incentives are being put in place. Felipe, can I get your comments first, and then I'll go quickly to Kamal.
Yes, of course. Well, there are some metrics. This is important, and I think well, well, you can see like the number, like who is using those open data framework is important. First off, like how you make sure like how they are using it, and which type of data they are providing. Is also something we have to understand, and those metrics are important to make in place. So I don't know, the number of MSMEs using this system is important. The type of data they will also they are able to provide to this to open data frameworks is important. So as I mentioned, like one of the pain points for MSMEs is providing documents. So if you like, okay, which type of documents you need for applying for credits is something that's good to measure, and you can also understand how you reduce like operational costs. So I think number like those, like the number of the credits, like how in the last years, how sorry, how much credit applications you have done, and I think those things can improve the decision-making metrics.
Yeah. Kamar, quick take on this before I proceed to the next question.
Thanks, Monica. So I think I'll break it up into two parts. I think one is what should we measure? I think that's one. And then the second question is how do we measure it? And let me kind of frame it like that. So in terms of what we should measure, I think first we need to measure the MSME specific monitoring frameworks, which tracks whether the reforms have actually resulted in improved access to finance, whether it has resulted in reduced compliance burdens, or it has enhanced data usability of SMEs. So you measure through a monitoring framework on this metric. then I think we also need to disaggregate impact metrics. For example, it's not enough to cross a board, but also look at enterprise size, look at the geography, look at the gender, look at the sector. So we must try and disaggregate the data. This helps to understand that which reforms are helping which segment more or less. So we need to also decipher through the monitoring mechanism. Also, in terms of we're in this panel, we're talking about the voice of the SME. I think how they are heard and how their policies. So we should also measure that, in terms of, are the SMEs involved in consultations? Are they involved in pilots? Are they involved in any governance bodies? And if they are not, if you're not tracking that, maybe we are intuitively thinking they're involved, but actually they're not. So if we track that, their participation and representation. So these are the three main aspects which I think what we should measure. Now, the bigger question is, how do we measure it? I think, and I briefly alluded to outcome-based dashboards to track the real world results, meaning like increased access to APIs or reduced time to comply. I think, how can we measure that? And then build feedback loops into DPIs, and seeing, how MSMEs are they continuously shaping the reforms as we go forward? And then evaluating the policy responsiveness, meaning how many SMEs, and Felipe alluded to that, how many SME recommendations are reflected actually in the final policies? Because if you hold the focus groups and you involve them, but actually the policy does not bring out what they actually wanted to kind of have in the policies, then I think it's just it's a futile exercise. So I think we should also see the policy responsiveness aspect, in terms of their contributions going forward. So that's briefly what I'll talk about. And yeah.
Thank you, Kamar. This actually is very important because when we talk about data governance and we talk about the data governance reforms, having their voice accurately reflected in these governance measures is extremely critical. Now, I know we're running short of time, so we only have time for closing remarks. I am also actively monitoring the chat in case there are any further questions. If not, maybe I can get your closing remarks starting with Kamar and then going to Philippe.
Sorry, Monica, there is one question
Yeah.
from in the chat to Philippe around federated APIs, and if that could actually be a solution, if that's something that he's monitoring.
Sorry, I missed that. Philippe, would you like to address that quickly?
Yes, well, yeah, we are actively making research on open banking and open finance. And yeah, harmonization is such a topic that we work in. And well, I think yes, ensuring the harmonization in data rails is, we are still working on that. But yes, we think like digital IDs and a good open source DPIs can be a solution. So if you design the digital public infrastructure to be inclusive, and of course having the what we are calling the regulatory delta, no, which, so not having vertical regulation, but horizontal, so involving many different stakeholders or policymakers to discuss the solutions, because like digital public infrastructure go across many different sectors in the government and also in the private sector. So ensuring this harmonization through good governance is, I think, is one way to use effectively the data rails. No, like, so you can create digital open source digital IDs. You can create like fast payment systems and other digital perfect infrastructure, but they have to talk to each other. No. And this is something we are still trying to understand in our research, because it's a quite new subject about harmonization. And yes, it's also something we see in our, as a result of our research, how like coordination is something super important for MSMEs and also like fintech firms. So they want to see more. They think coordination is very important coming from a policymaker, but also, for instance, the knowledge of those policymakers into like the market, it's in their industry itself. So if you have good harmonization and coordination, you start creating capacity building, and you can then harmonize these horizontal bodies to work horizontally and then bring harmonization. And DPI could be a very good solution for it.
Thank you, Felipe. I just have time for one last question. Kamar, are you still there? I don't see you on the video. Just checking. So I have a question on, maybe Felipe, I can address this question to you quickly. But how do we
Yes.
take into account what and how fintech and private public partnerships can actually help accelerate some of these friendly frameworks that are designed in mind specifically for MSMEs? Because I heard we've mentioned a few things: tech, we've mentioned collaboration, we've mentioned associations, and of course a lot of this to come together to reflect the voice of MSMEs. And in this, partnerships is a very, very important aspect. So how can some of these public-private partnerships help to accelerate this friendliness towards MSME data frameworks?
Yes, well, again, I think without the public-private partnership, there's no way to create those digital bulk infrastructure. No, you cannot just account on one side to build such structures. And then if you think in terms of like credit access, no, okay, governments will work into providing or standardize or designing good policies for those public infrastructure, but then you have to think, okay, how the private sector will come together and use those structure to then I don't know, afford more credits to MSMEs to close the gap, because here is where we are missing something in my point of view. No, okay, you have like open banking regimes going out in the world, and for instance, the Brazilian case is very successful. Like you have like millions of people joining the financial system. Okay, it's cool. Like using that majorly for payments, but then and you are seeing like many private sector or companies like fintech companies developing new business model. But okay, now again, what's the next step? No, what I have to measure to now, okay, offer better products. No, like tailor these products to the needs of MSMEs, because they need more representation, but maybe it's not still reflecting in terms of products they need or to access these credits. So okay, after the implementation phase, I think those working groups and co-creation space innovation offices are key to see, okay, now after the implementation phase, we need the next step, which is finding the innovation. So yes, innovation offices, co-creation space, and ensuring that those policies, as Mr. Kramer said, maybe like only having, okay, sandboxes are good, but it's impossible to involve everyone. So maybe having those co-creation space can be, or feedback mechanisms can be very important for the next phase of development after the implementation of those digital public infrastructures.
Thank you, Felipe. This was really insightful, and I really do believe that a tech-based partnership and approach is going to really help us get the voice of the MSMEs in data governance and frameworks related to policy. But thank you so much to Felipe and Kamar. He's having technical snags. That's why he's not here right now. But this has been a very insightful discussion on empowering MSMEs in this open data policy making frameworks that we have. We've uncovered the importance of inclusive frameworks and, of course, industry collaboration, and what are some of the measurable outcomes that we should be gunning for. Of course, we've seen a few examples and heard from the panelists about what has really worked and how to get MSMEs at the and give them a rightful seat at the table. Thank you for advocating for these policies that will help amplify the voices of MSMEs. And with this, I hand back to Holly to take this forward from here.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Felipe and Kamar, for your contributions. It's interesting. One thing that I was thinking as you were having that discussion that I don't think it came up, but in addition to obviously having direct and active engagement and organized engagement of SMEs, actually as larger organizations are navigating regulatory change, where we can, as larger organizations, lend a voice to our small business customers in the policymaking process. That's another area where it's really helpful. But also when looking at regulatory change, which is targeted at large institutions that operate cross borders, really pointing out the intended or unintended consequences of those policies on the ability for larger businesses to offer products and services to SMEs in different markets is really a critical thing, because often, regulators and policymakers, particularly in this space of data, and have very reasonable and sound policy objectives in rolling out policies and regulations that dictate how data can be held and moved, even domestically, actually in the end only impact the ability of businesses to provide products and services which will enable the SMEs themselves to grow and participate more in cross-border trade. So with that, we're going to move to our second panel. And I'm going to hand over to Rahul Bhargava, who is going to moderate our panel discussing the need to address regulatory mismatches in open data frameworks. Thanks, Rahul. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks for that. And a great segue to this topic, addressing regulatory mismatches in open data frameworks. I often look back at conversations with central bankers and regulators about open data standards and the question of whether they are converging, consolidating, or fragmenting. And often the conversation starts at one end and ends up at the fragmentation end. And this panel is trying to peel the onion a bit on this truth that we are increasingly seeing, that when it comes to real-world implementation of open data frameworks, technical standardization, like ISO 222, for example, is just not enough. It's not the lack of APIs, but rather the lack of the regulatory alignment to begin with, a lack of trust and trust anchors underlying, and challenges with essentially underlying infrastructure and the overall drive itself for reaching alignment across jurisdictions. So fundamental challenges of fragmentation in the regulatory space and the infrastructure space. So we'll review this through some thought leadership and some market insights, as well as some real life use cases. I have with me today a really good panel of experts. One is Douglas Arner from Silence Laboratories, and we have Maxim Nesheret from CMA. So let me open up the conversation first with Douglas. You spent time looking at regulations across the world and reviewing and analyzing, and as well as you published some thought leadership on this space. I would love to hear your views on what you see globally and in Asia Pacific as well, in terms of the fragmentation we're speaking about, in terms of regulatory and infrastructure approaches, perhaps. It'll be great to hear more about real life implementations as well, and how they're getting increasingly complicated by aspects like data protection, cybersecurity, and other factors. And also at the same time, maybe a comment also on trust anchors and their relevance to this entire dialogue. Douglas, over to you.
Thanks, Rahul. And I'd like to say also thanks to ABAC, APFF, and EPAA for the invitation and the coordination. And I should say, for all my friends on the call, I'm still very much at the University of Hong Kong. I think it's a typo on the Solidus Labs. I'm not even sure what that is. As Rahul mentioned, my team has just finished a major study looking at, and the title I just shared it in the chat, called Building Open Finance, from Policy to Infrastructure. And I think in many ways, the title of that paper sums up many of the issues and the challenges that we're looking at. And I want to say first that I'm really coming at this from the direction of finance. I basically focus on finance, financial sector development, financial inclusion issues, and the role of technology. So a lot of my work focuses on the intersection between finance, data, and technology. And so I'm going to be framing this coming from the finance angle, but I really want to take out, I think, two different pieces from the paper. And then I think a little bit later in the second part, we'll talk about some of the structural approaches that we're actually seeing and some of the lessons that we can learn from Nexus, from Aperta, from a range of other sorts of ongoing projects. So the first of these is really this idea of evolution. And what I often find when one is talking about open banking, open finance, open data, that people are actually coming from very different perspectives. And it often means that what I may be talking about actually is completely different from the direction that someone else is coming from. And I think we see this particularly from the standpoint of those three frames: open banking, open finance, open data. Now, technically, open banking is about methods, mechanisms, requirements for sharing information between banks. And that's quite important because when we think about fragmentation, open banking is generally driven by central banks and banking regulators. They often don't have scope of authority of finance outside of their area, nor do they have any scope of authority on data outside of the financial sector. So if you're talking about a jurisdiction where you have a responsible party that is coming from an open banking perspective, and they're trying to have a conversation with someone who's talking about open data, very frequently, fundamentally, they're not talking about the same thing. And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about data and data in finance. Finance is a highly regulated industry, and this means that it comes with its own regulatory frameworks, many of which govern data. Data today now has an increasingly complicated regulatory framework of its own. And if one is talking about data outside of finance, one can ignore all of the financial regulations. But if one is dealing with data in finance, one has to deal with both the financial regulatory perspective as well as the data regulatory perspective. So I think this first aspect of fragmentation is actually about differences in approach. Similarly, this development of the idea of open banking or open finance or open data has come from a variety of different sources. From one direction, it's come from what has almost been a social movement, this idea of the ability to control one's own data. From another, if we think about the EU experience, it actually came from mechanisms to reduce banks' dominance of particularly the payment system to enable new forms of competition. Increasingly today, we're thinking about data frameworks for credit, or we're thinking about data frameworks from the standpoint of empowering AI, a very broad range of different approaches. So that's one. Second idea is traditionally in open banking or open finance, we characterize approaches as industry-led, regulatory-led, or mandatory. And I think what we're seeing as a general trend is more and more jurisdictions moving towards mandatory approaches, because in many cases, industry-led hasn't worked. Regulator-led can work in some narrow contexts, but we're typically finding that if one wants to have significant movement towards free transferability of data, it requires a mandatory approach. But as I think was highlighted several times, both in the introductory remarks from Raul, but also already in the discussion, just having that set of standards or even a mandatory requirement actually isn't enough. And so now we're seeing, as was just talked about in the Brazilian context, an increasing range of jurisdictions which are building specific infrastructures to enable data sharing within their jurisdictions. And in many cases, those are working best in jurisdictions which have what I frame as first generation DPI, digital public infrastructure systems, which are typically ID, account frameworks, and fast payment systems. And if you're a jurisdiction like Brazil or India that has a first generation DPI framework, this provides a basis for infrastructure for a system to enable use of data. Now, that's essentially just the domestic context. And so once we try to add in the cross-border aspect, trying to join up the dots between what is already a very disparate set of approaches is a challenge. But I think the lesson to come out of domestic trends so far is there is this movement towards broader data strategies. Second, there's a move towards more mandatory approaches, whether that is just for banking, for finance across the financial sector, or for a number of jurisdictions like UAE or Australia that are trying to go beyond banking or finance. And finally, this trend domestically, which I think is central to the cross-border discussion of trying to build infrastructure, which then actually enables use and sharing of data on a cross-border basis.
Thanks, Douglas. And looking at both domestic and cross-border, one of the areas which has been tremendously fragmented and essentially getting more and more complex every day with the number of form factors, the number of stakeholders involved, is payments. And Douglas, you refer to that as well as part of your comments. I would like to turn to Maxim now. And given, Maxim, that CMA has been one of the global drivers of evolution of the payment systems or national infrastructures driving payments globally, how do you view this challenge of regulatory disparity, standards, fragmentation, when you think about it from a cross-border and a domestic perspective? Great to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, as you mentioned, so that's we're dealing to building those infrastructure. Yeah, I'm doing that for last 20 years. What I see during last 10, 15 years, most of those operators of national infrastructure, they more concentrated on the, let's call it, technical aspects of transaction processing, right? It should be fast, secure, everybody should be integrated. So interoperability on technical level. Most of operators with whom I work actually don't have this open data agenda in their strategy at all, right? Only few work in this direction, majority no, probably because of the lack of regulatory direction, right? So, or lack of understanding the value of this data exchange framework on national level, because sometimes they say we don't see the business case and it's not happening. So majority of them, they're not even collecting or processing the data or instructing the participant of national infrastructure to do it for them. There are, of course, some exceptions. We see that it starts to change, as Douglas mentioned, so the PIGS, the NPCI. I work very closely with the Central Bank of Philippines. I believe for more than last decades, they're leading national ISO 2022 schema that is applicable for high value payments as well as for retail payments. And they keep increasing the number of data points that need to be incorporated into the payment instructions. And I think it's going quite well. Of course, there are a lot of challenges. And as I mentioned, it's more than a decade already. But I see this movement, I see the improvement that leads to not only the fast, secure transaction processing, but as well as the capability of the receiving institution to perform some additional compliance check in automated mode because the data already there. And it's in line with the schema rules that are mandated by the central banks. And of course, it's in line with the National Data Privacy Act. So there are ways how to solve it. But the next level of the problem is not the central infrastructure, but last mile, right? So the many financial institutions, especially commercial banks, they rely on the legacy system. The data is fragmented. It's not structured. They don't have a capability to actually to follow the rules of those operators. They cannot enrich the data and exchange data with their counterparty, even the infrastructure is in place. So I don't know how long it will take to solve this problem, the problem of last mile. Maybe years, maybe decades, but yeah, it's need to be addressed as well. So for national operators, what I see, while the technical solution might be there, the lack of the strategy in terms of data management and data exchange is just not in their agenda. They believe it's outside of their responsibility. Probably some regulatory guidance as well as some education and discussion with the industry participant might fix the situation. If we move to the cross-border space, like, so we're doing those regional payment system from 2013, I think, no, 2003, yeah. We have 5 of them already. We have single currency blocks. We have the multi-currency blocks where the multiple central banks building some central infrastructure for that. Single currency, it's more or less straightforward, right? So it's the single monetary policy, the regulation somehow aligned. And here what we see, it's again, lack of strategy and the last mile problem. So it's just there. And I believe the regulatory involvement in this mandatory approach is the most efficient one. If we talk about more complex case, when the multiple central banks are building some common infrastructure, then it's become much more complicated. So right now, what we're facing, full regulatory alignment, it's nearly impossible. So what we're doing at the end, we're building fences. So each jurisdiction will have sort of gateway that will maintain the data privacy. It will be responsible for the structuring of data when it's passing to the counterparty. And usually the amount of data that those gateway exchange, it's the minimum one. And we need to take care about the security of this data. So it's tokenization, make sure it's only counterparty will be able to see this data when they're receiving information, not the central node. So there are technical solutions for that, but yeah, regulatory alignment, of course, the availability of some sort of digital IDs that might be exchanged, probably the future, but right now it's not happening. So we're building fences and we're replicating those national approaches when we're connecting the jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Actually, you raised some great points, and it really resonates when you say that the sense of ownership or accountability even is missing, in terms of owning what is required to be done by either national infrastructures or even regulators at point. So I would come back to Douglas for a quick question, and maybe just a reflection on what you spoke about the approaches, and even Maxim mentioned that the mandatory approach seems to be working. Douglas, from your perspective, if you take maybe an example of how a mandatory approach has worked well in a market and established trust and trust anchors, perhaps versus something that's not. If you could just share a quick view of that, that'll be really helpful, I think, for this conversation.
Thanks, Rahul. Actually, I wanted to pick up a couple of things from Maxim's points. I think first, and this is actually coming from a project that Monica and I were just finishing up with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, where essentially we're looking at the implementation of first generation DPI and sort of implications for second generation. And Maxim, one thing that we've seen is that quite a lot of jurisdictions which have been implementing, say, first generation DPI, the fast payment systems, the ID frameworks, that often they don't actually even have data laws. So in other words, if you don't have a data law, then it's not even something. And so now now that they have this framework, they're now thinking about how to build the data law. So it's actually a good time from the standpoint of thinking about some of these issues. But I wanted to, as Rahul was saying, I want to narrow in on some of these infrastructure systems that we're seeing. And as I said, I think in this second generation review, we've seen a number of jurisdictions which are basically thinking about how can we use first generation DPI systems to then enable that as a basis for a data system. And we're seeing this In some cases, broadly, one can think about Singapore's MyInfo system as a mechanism which enables as an infrastructure to share data. One can think about some of the developments in Brazil or the UAE or India's sort of ongoing development of data aggregators. But we also see a number of more narrow examples. So if we think about, we've talked a lot about payments, and I think payments provide a good use case, but we're also seeing a couple of other areas where people are trying to do this. One is in the context of credit information. In other words, every jurisdiction has requirements on credit information sharing. There's often a credit information registry. How can one then build an infrastructure that makes this data better and more widely usable? And I think if one is thinking about a cross-border context, in addition to payments, the credit information is going to be one of those logical next steps, because one of the key lessons, and I think Maxim highlighted this, is everyone's project is finding that the technology is workable. It's often the legal and governance issues that are providing the real headaches. And as I was framing in my first bit, those are very fragmented, and so it makes it a real challenge. And I think going forward, the other area of digital public infrastructure that is very much missing and that we need to sort out domestically and cross-border to make this work for the MSME problem is digital identity relating to companies and entities. And that's very much a second generation IDI challenge, but it's necessary to link the data.
Thanks, Douglas. And that is a massive challenge indeed, from various perspectives. And I think MSMEs and really benefit if that's taken on priority. I think we are almost at time. So a parting question to both of you. There's something which we have touched upon, but not really looked at during this last 20-25 minutes of conversation. And it's deeply related to the regulatory fragmentation and inherent cultural almost and decision values. Data localization, right? And we think about cross-border interoperability and fungibility of data, payments, and other aspects of finance. If we look at data localization as the challenge, what's your view for both of you on what could be one or two key actions that can be taken to overcome that challenge? Maybe Max first and then Douglas.
Yeah, for this one, I don't see much problem if the data will be stored locally. We definitely need some framework to be able to confirm validity of certain requests, like it should be identity, credit scoring, or something else, using the secure way of communication, considering the privacy and all those things. Again, technology is there. Just the way that the people need to agree what they can exchange and what safeguards need to be in place. And it takes decades. Even this infrastructure to process payments only, we don't talk about the data. Preparation itself takes 10, 15 years, right? Before the project starts. When you start the project, you start to face all those issues about the data privacy, and you find technical solution that. But yeah, the agreement must be in place, and technology, we have multiple options to solve this task.
Douglas?
I'll just say exactly agree with Max, and I flagged a paper in the chat, but essentially we discussed this idea, and I think the next panel is going to be discussing this as well. And I think this is a key point, and I would flag that in addition to essentially federated data structures, which is very much, I think, a trend that we're going to. The second is, I don't think data localization rules are going away, and that's something that we're just going to have to work around. The third point, and something to take away that I think is quite interesting, is we're seeing a number of regional approaches to try to build data centers. some big announcements in the GCC along these lines last week, and we've seen a number of others. And I think this is a very interesting idea that we're seeing more and more jurisdictions look.
Fantastic. Thanks for those comments. And time obviously is required for trust and infrastructures to mature enough to the point where value comes automatically to MSMEs and other corporate and other segments. So thanks a lot for the comments. I really appreciate it. A great conversation. Back to you, Holly, to take the conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you.
I think, Douglas, you've summed it up so well. The technology is working. It's the legal and regulatory frameworks, which are very, very fragmented. And it reminds me of your final comment back to Javier's point at the beginning of the session today, that actually industry shouldn't and isn't calling for no regulation, because there needs to be a level of fit for purpose regulation to ensure you get the benefits of trust and trust in the movement of data. And so it does make me think, one piece of the puzzle that maybe we can do some more work on is how do we get consistent terminology in policymaking, and the language and the definitions of certain concepts. Certainly in payments, this is something that we really need to do a bit more work on. And it's just one piece of the puzzle. But that was a really interesting discussion with lots for us to unpack going forward. And with that, Camilla is on, and I was thinking, what on earth is Camilla doing on? Have I done something wrong? But I realized it's because she is going to moderate our final session, which is a relief for us all, but mostly me. So I'll hand over to Camilla for her session on her favourite subject of privacy enhancing technologies.
Thank you so much. I just have to squeeze in one comment there, because it's so hard. Turn my video off, I would bounce it. So many good remarks. And I think that's what we're saying about terminology. I was on a panel on open data just the other week. Open Finance it was called. It was with the Cambridge Institute of Alternative Finance and Philippe. And we talked about liability. And of course, that is a super important topic in this. But then we talked about, if we don't call, in this case, when we're talking about the payment service initiators, the same thing in different markets, that liability is very different. And we can't do things together, because the liability is much bigger in one market than the others when we don't talk about the same thing. So good point there, Holly. But I'm going to invite my panelists to talk about privacy enhancing technology. So I have Aslina Idris with me. Aslina is the Senior Director and Head of Strategy and ESG Office at PayNet Malaysia. Thank you very much for joining us, Aslina. And I have Jay Prakash. He is the CEO and founder of Silence Laboratories. You can almost hear on the name that he is the privacy enhancing technologist in this call. And as Holly said, this is a topic that I'm very, very interested in. For a long time, I was just holding out and did what I know that many other people are thinking is that zero knowledge proof, this ZKP acronym, was something that was going to solve this. I thought, like, once we get them in the room, they were told us has to do, we need to do some standards around it, and then Bob's our uncle and we can go away and do this. Then in January, BIS wrote a really good paper on privacy enhancing technology that really opened my eyes that it's not that simple. And I think we have simplified a little bit in our industry what PETs, the privacy enhancing technology, could potentially do for us. But I think before we get there, there is a lot of work to unpack and terminology to agree on and technology to understand. So I'm going to kick this off with Aslina. So you are the payments person in this discussion, the practitioner, you are infrastructure in Malaysia. Today, what and how are you talking about privacy enhancing technology within your organization?
So, okay, let me just provide context on where we are in Malaysia as far as privacy is concerned. Data privacy, we do have the law that protects it. It's actually a general law under the Personal Data Protection Act. And then on top of that, there's the banking, regulations under the Financial Services Act. Now, privacy enhancing technology is something that is kind of like a new terminology that's being used, but if you actually take it from the point of view of data protection for the purpose of payments and making sure that the personal data of a payer and payee is protected, that is something that is actually a work in progress that has been there for a long, long time. specifically is actually in the context of open banking, open finance, which Malaysia is pursuing right this moment. And at the same time, if you look at where we are at by Q3, God willing, we would be having a POC in place for the industry to test in. And in that particular construct, as you correctly pointed out, privacy enhancing technology will be very, very relevant because how we share personal data with our own participants, across participants, and for that matter, we want to be able to do it on a cross-border basis. You know that we already connected across, several corridors. All that comes into play, right about immediately. So in that sense, where we are coming from is that we want to be able to, ensure there is anonymity except for the people who actually really need to know the information, right? So, and we don't want to have a situation where you have an open finance and open banking platform, but data is actually being transported, backwards and forwards without it being encrypted, it being having this, PET in place. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there before we get into the deeper things. Yeah.
Interesting. I would have had more question on that, but I'm going to let Jay in straight away and see when Aslina is saying this, is this what you think about when you think about privacy enhancing technology? And also what do you think it can enable? Can you even point into certain areas of what Aslina is saying with the open data frameworks and cross-border payments?
Right. No, yeah, thank you very much for having me. Like you pointed out, privacy enhancing technologies are very complicated topic. It's not simple, and there is no silver bullet out in market. Companies can claim it just for sake of claiming, but yeah, there's no single tech which can solve all the problem. And the core element here is that why do we need pets? We need pets because I, as the custodian or the owner of the data, I can't compute every function out there in the world to avail services. Which brings the topic of delegation. Some enterprises need to be delegated, need to hold custody of my data. I can be enterprise or a retail user, and that delegation should not require trust assumptions. That's the ultimate thing which can happen in a perfect world, which is the party which is computing on my data should be just able to compute what I have delegated the party to do, nothing else. If that is possible, then we have achieved a perfect privacy. Otherwise, the moment we hear about privacy toolings, the one word which hurts me a lot is data sharing. We don't need to share data. I mean, once we share data, there is nothing involved which can stop copying of data and cross-selling it. I can talk about all the legal compliances and everything. There is no way involved to stop me from copying and cross-selling and do whatever I want because the current tech are not there to verify the user of data after data has been shared. So when I hear privacy, I typically think of proper delegation, which does not require any trust assumption. The party should be able to compute just consented function and should not be able to see my data. If those things are achieved, we are perfect. We have achieved something which we can be proud of down the line. And there are technical movements happening, which we can talk about in detail in that direction. Yeah, we will reach there in some time.
Yeah, so that layer is what I always refer to, that zero knowledge proof. That's what we're saying, I'm saying it's okay, I have it, and then we can do whatever that is. But sorry, I'm taking it down quite a bit here. But when we spoke, you talked about efficiency more, and that it even happens within the organization more than outside and between parties. Could you just elaborate a little bit on real life cases that you've seen on this?
Yeah, so
we're getting some fresh news straight in from the factory.
I know, yeah, probably some issue with the booking. Right. So, I mean, there are very simple cases. Let's say I'm a payment company. I have my phone number of all the users of my payment company. And I want to enrich my phone number so that I can provide better services. When I say enrichment, I mean I want to associate each phone number with the type of expense they do, their economic status, or some kind of categorization. One way is that I will just sign a legal contract with a data enricher. There are many more in market and do it. But in that process, I'm leaking all the lists of the customers who through my mobile number database. If we use pets, there are ways to just do comparison between two data sets. The querying party can query in the data, use data set, and figure out if there's a match with the phone number or not. If there is a match, they will retrieve data. But if we use privacy technologies properly, they will not expose to this data broker whom I searched for and what data actually was retrieved. And that's a very simple abstraction of two-party data collaboration. Data never moved. And even if it moved, it was pure encrypted search, encrypted operation happening around. If you read, you mentioned about BIS. So BIS did a project called Mandala for cross-border payments, right? In that, they are doing sanctionless check using privacy tools, where they do two-bank collaboration, two-bank search without exposing whom they search for before the transaction happens. There are many more checks which can be done. Secure search is the most primitive form factor, which we can talk about. You can go as complicated as running an ML model on complicated data sets.
Yeah, no, yeah, perfect for this discussion here. Now, I'm just going to bounce back to Selina on this. So just in this example where we're using telephone numbers and enriched data, the challenges you see to include MSME, can you see that this technology could enable more rich data? And what are the challenges you see? Is it around AML, identity? What do you see in Malaysia today?
So one thing about the MSMEs in Malaysia, I think for that matter across ASEAN, is actually the formal legal establishment, right? So for one thing, they may not be organized in such a way that they're registered with any form of formal registry, and they may be conducting businesses under different names, right? So basically, where I'm coming at is actually the data on them and the digital identity as well as their digital presence is kind of like fragmented and is causing kind of like noises in verifying whether or not he is who he is, right? And to link that particular identity and track record and transactions, you need to kind of like combine a lot of unstructured data and structured data. You'll have situations where they don't even have a bank account. They actually have it through money changers or informal providers like credit providers that's not in the formal banking system. All they have is actually deposit accounts, right? So basically you have a situation where even the name of the shop that they have does not match the name of the business that's in the registry if they're ever registered in the first place. So that is actually the very the most well-known challenge, I would say, in getting them to be known and for that matter to even use PET. But I think it's going back to Jay's point, right? That's where we feel that having some kind of tool where we can actually combine all this digital presence data and kind of like do some kind of validation so that they can have some kind of, I would say, on-chain or kind of like a combination of information and data that could form their own identity, and we kind of like transport it to them neatly to say that is this you, and the moment that forms, you can have then a proper track record that's built onto it, and they would then be able to avail to some kind of credit services or validation services, and therefore start to be served by the formal financial sector.
You talked about it like there's a mosaic identity where you take all the different pieces without actually knowing the pieces. So when we don't know them, it's very hard to put them together or where they should come from. So Jay, this all sounds great, and this is what I have a strong belief in. But what stands between us to actually start to do that? So if we look at a governance arrangement and institutional models that need to be in place for PET to really be used in a high trust environment?
Right. Probably there definitely is a gap between capabilities of different privacy technologies and understandings from legal community, because and if that gap can be reduced, probably adoption will kick off. Very simple case, like we as a company, we do lots of research and also business using technology like multi-party compute. And in multi-party compute, you take data, you shard it into pieces, and then you can compute on that. So one single shard has no meaning at all. Even quantum computing can't break and create an inference out of it if they capture less than a threshold or number of shards. And you can locate these shares in a different geographies, let's say for the sake of a proper trust model. Now, when regulators will come into picture, they will think that you have moved data actually between borders, but that's not true. You have moved a share which is totally nonsense from information perspective, and this gap needs to be reduced, which probably requires some frameworks, more communication, and more communication with experts and the researchers in the field, and some kind of a framework thinking model, which companies are working on, we are working on as well. But yeah, that gap is something which is stopping a couple of adoptions. And every company out there is waiting, okay, the moment regulator will tell me I can use this tech, then I will be happy. But that's not going to happen in world. No regulator will tell to use these pets. They can just vouch for the guarantees in a more non-biased way. And the best thing I have seen so far is from ICO in UK. What they have done to popularize pets, their adoption is uncomparable in anywhere in geography in terms of nations' contributions. So ICO websites very much properly articulate which pets can solve what, because yeah, like I told, there's no silver bullet. But such initiatives from legal community to understand more will help, and there we can certainly help as a company as well. But yeah, these two people need to talk.
It's interesting, and in one thing we always say we shouldn't regulate the tech or like sign off the techs. It is really the outcomes that we're interested in. I think though that maybe one thing lacking a little bit still is that capacity building and understanding of the different flavors of the tech that need to come first to agree on what definitions need to be in play. But Selena, I know that you have lots of knowledge and experience from sandboxes. Is this a use case to try to test privacy enhancing technology with participants in the market to see what we need to do and to help to understand what it can enable? What do you think about that? What could be a road for that?
I think, yeah, I mean, to me, one of the key things that is stopping financial inclusion, right, is actually data sharing. And open data is one way of getting there. And PET is actually something that you can certainly explore and leverage for a secure data sharing to happen. Now, to me, if we want to be looking at it into kind of like with great clarity, specific use cases needs to be built, in the sense that, you know, you need to build, first is, you know, what use case are you trying to solve for? The second layer would be what kind of data do you need? And then the third layer would be what kind of consent framework do you need to have in place? And lastly, what kind of PET that can facilitate those particular, you know, levels of details, right? Because a few things, first, one is that I fully agree with.
No. Oh gosh, I thought it was me that got lost, but I can see Jay moving. I fell out before. So we'll see why Selena is. Oh, there she is. You're back on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry. Where you dropped out.
Yeah. So basically, on the layering of these things, I fully agree with Jay in the sense that if you're looking at it from a pure data portability point of view, data should not be moving places, right? And it should not be stored by someone else. What should happen is access to data, the way I want it, the level I want it, the time I want it. and therefore, you know, you can have that integrity in place and intact for certain use cases to happen, and only for that use case, right? Because otherwise the presence of abuses will come into play. So in essence, where I'm coming from is that, you know, we need to be looking at all these very, very kind of like relevant, unsolvable use cases that can easily be solved with PET, and then, you know, kind of like deeper and start to test it in in very different environments. First in within the country, and then perhaps maybe cross border. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like testing it in country and then work towards for a niche use case. What is the minimum standard we need to reach?
Yeah.
Interesting. So Jay, like that's quite a defined thing what to do. If you would talk to an institution about, can we trust this on the, no, can we do this on this use case? What is the most common concern they bring to you?
The common concern they bring is, first of all, it's very hard. When I say there are ways to do compute on encrypted data, it's a bit hard to digest, first of all. So yeah, first we need to cross that barrier. Okay, that is possible. Then yeah, we need to prove somehow and get their trust that whenever such collaborations are happening between multiple institutions, you are not actually moving data, you are just moving compute, moving inference. So yeah, explaining that certainly becomes challenging at point. It depends on the person we are talking to. But for a non-technical user, certainly, yeah, that's a friction which I see being faced by different companies. And we have been designing proper tooling to address that through simulations or through other techniques. But the guarantee will come through your proper audits. So your audit has been helping in general. Once you can claim that, okay, you have audited this code through a third party who understand those things, then they will. That's number one. And one friction which we have been also understanding is a couple of such initiatives and adoption of pets require creation of a consortium, a structure or network, and that's a big lift. A company which is still a small startup can't do it. That requires more lift coming from bigger organizations or some consortiums, because then you can appreciate pets much better. Let's say hypothetically we are creating a network of all the banks in Singapore so that we can create much better AML modeling. It's possible. Theoretically, we have proven it. If all the banks in Singapore can talk, your MLs will drop down by huge margin in terms of, yeah, I'm not able to catch. But that requires everybody to buy in. And then who will do it? So those kinds of questions also comes into picture when you have to deploy. So the form factor and productization of pets is something which people are working on right now, so that the integration, the adoption becomes much more easier. But yeah, there's a trade-off between central party running all the infrastructure or involving all the parties together. And that has to do with who will manage DevOps for all these technologies. So yeah, those things we have to handle. Once we do it, probably adoption will kick off.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a challenge there. We're doing quite a bit of migration to quantum safe cryptography, and also one of those super techie topics. But you need to have the business folks in the room. You need them to understand to allocate the budget to do the POC or what we need to do. So just very quick, just like one sentence from each of you, because before we get Holly on. One thing you would like to see the APFF and EPA leading in this. What is it? One thing, if we could do this. It's a hard one, I know. So I give you a few seconds to think. And also, you audience, if you have anything that you think this is what we need more, just write your suggestion in the chat and we'll pick it up, because it is a topic we want to do more with, but it's quite tricky to know where to start. So Eslina, you're nodding, so maybe you have something for us.
Well, it's not so much a one word or one sentence, but I would love for this PET to have a defined role for, you know, the key players, like the ecosystem, the users, you know, the regulators, the payment infrastructure provider, kind of like have this you know, defined role, kind of like, you know, wish list of some sort that would enable people to say, okay, now I'm going to act on the PET technology. I'm going to take a look at the BIS paper, and I'm going to see what role do I play. What am I going to do next?
Yep. That's a good one. That feels like something we can tackle. It's not too high up there, so let's.
It's not too high up. Yeah.
Jay, what's from you?
Yeah, I would probably be very happy if we can think from a first principle perspective and just break the paradigm of data delegation or delegated computation, and then define the whole spectrum. And then every solution can come in and fit in over there and with a predefined expectations. Something similar was done in custody space 2 or 3 years back. Everybody was claiming around 3 years back is their self-custody until FTX happened. Then things started to make more proper form factor. Yeah, something like that. Proper first principle based framework for defining delegated computation, and that a consortium organizations like you can do it.
Yeah, we might need a little bit of help from you on that one. Thank you very much, Selina and Jay. It's really interesting when we take those heavy tech topics into what we're doing as practitioners from day to day. So Holly, this is me from this panel. Do you want to have a chat about what happened today in this workshop?
In the whole workshop? Not this panel.
Oh, no, you can do this panel first.
I actually think just listening to that conversation, like to your point, it can be highly technical, but it also needs to be highly technical because it's delivering probably the hardest outcome, which is giving individual citizens, but also policymakers confidence that people's privacy is being managed securely, that they're kept safe and the global economy is being kept safe, which is really the objective of many of the privacy regulations that govern this. So I think one thing that I take away from the whole session is kind of similar, Camilla, to what you just asked then. Like, what is one thing that we could do, but very specifically to help policy makers understand, like, which are the precise regulations, like which provisions, like we had a little conversation about this, unrelated, but it's stuck in my mind, in pieces of legislation are the most problematic, and why are they the most problematic, with real life case studies, use cases, examples of how they're actually impacting or impeding business from happening, and particularly from small businesses being able to participate more effectively in the economy. So I think today, like, we've talked about a lot of different things, and there's a lot of things we can go away and build on. But I think the big call out to everybody who's joined us today is any ideas or suggestions that you have, or any examples that you've come across in your day-to-day jobs that you can share with us, that we can turn into case studies that we can take back to the different groups that we participate in and share the outcomes of these sessions, is very valuable.
Excellent. Thank you, Holly. And I think having Javier setting it out on trade example is still really good, because it impacts everyone if we can do that, down to market level and financial inclusion. So it's such an important topic to crack. So thank you everybody who has joined in today, all the moderators and the panelists, and specifically you audience. It's a long workshop to sit through. We will go through all your comments. I think we have some slides of upcoming activities we have in EPA that you might want to see first. And Neve, do you want to share them? Good. So we have quantum safe cryptography workshop both in Hong Kong and Sydney. This is really capacity building and awareness of how do we start this migration that is so important applied to the payments industry. Then we have a community event in Hong Kong where you will also hear the roundup from those quantum safe cryptography workshops. They are aimed for business people. This is not brain for the quantum experts, business people. And we also have an EPA with some roundtables coming up in Singapore, 18th of July. So stay tuned on that. It might come some more online sessions in between that. We do when something important happening in the industry. I also want to do a call out that you that on this call are the most innovative, passionate payments people leaning into the discussions. So very likely you might want to submit either yourself as a payments leader of the year, or maybe even a lifetime achievement in payment, or just that you're working for a very excellent, innovative company. The entries are free. This is our call out to find the short list of the most innovative solutions in APAC. JC, before we end up, what would you like to say about this session as an ending note?
Okay, well, thanks, Camila. Well, I would say that, this very fruitful discussion really underscored the validity of our foundational thesis when we started our work on this subject a few years ago, which is that open data systems, first of all, need to be designed to fit the specific conditions in each market. And that's because, customer centricity is very important. At the same time, they need to be based on commonly agreed principles to avoid fragmentation of our region into isolated digital islands. And there is a role for open data to promote financial inclusion and expand access to MSMEs, particularly to enable them to engage more fully in Asia-Pacific cross-border trade. Let me just highlight three of my takeaways from the discussions. I think the first one is to better tailor open data to benefit MSMEs. It would be really helpful to enable their participation in open data policymaking. And this would require a comprehensive approach that would include aspects like governance, structural enablers, incentives, including mechanisms for their participation and representation in relevant bodies and dialogues, creating awareness, establishment of metrics, and access to regulatory sandboxes, APIs, and digital infrastructure in general. So that's the first. The second, the big challenge facing open data is not technology, but regulatory fragmentation that arises both domestically due to involvement of financial data and other laws and regulations, and cross-border due to the trend of individual jurisdictions building their own specific infrastructure that will need to be made interoperable if we want to avoid fragmentation. And then adding to this is the challenges faced by the industry that is still dependent on legacy systems and still struggling to develop strategies which would require closer collaboration and especially collaboration with regulators. The third is that pets, as we have discussed, have significant potential to help overcome data privacy challenges in open data. But wider adoption of pets will require correct treatment by laws and regulations, which in turn requires better understanding by the legal and regulatory communities, both domestically and regionally. And it also needs the active encouragement by governments. So what's really coming out of these discussions is that the work to develop open data into something that will benefit MSMEs and support efficient cross-border business and APEC's regional ambitions will take time to progress and will need strong support across jurisdictions and from both public and private sectors. So that's the challenge. The good news is that this year, under APEC finance minister's process, under the leadership of Korea's Ministry of Economy and Finance, they're launching a new medium-term roadmap to succeed the Cebu Action Plan in guiding the work for the next 5 years. So what we're trying to do is we're aiming to propose the inclusion of this work on open data in that roadmap, incorporating the key insights that have come out of today's discussions. So we really hope that this will be considered by the finance ministers when they meet at their annual meeting in Incheon this coming October. We are hopeful that the topic of open finance and open data will gain more visibility in the region after the ministerial meeting, and that decision and policymakers will look at this issue with greater interest. And this will create new opportunities for collaboration between government and industry. So we really hope that our network of collaborators in the private sector and international organizations, especially those who are with us here today, will remain willing to collaborate with the public sector and the relevant APEC working groups in advancing them toward implementation. So let me just, again, as I close, thank EPA Asia for co-organizing this webinar with us, as well as all our colleagues in ABAC and APFF for their collaboration. Deepest appreciation to speakers and moderators. And I thank our colleagues in APEC and APFF and all the participants for joining us in this event. And so building on what we have discussed today, I really look forward to our continued collaboration for the development of interoperable open data systems in our region that will benefit consumers, small businesses, the industry, and our economies. So thank you very much, and I wish everyone a pleasant evening and day ahead.
Thank you, JC, and thank you, everyone. We're looking forward to see you next time.